Well, let's see. And the reason they asked is I think there's a deal. There's a deal on Hormuz, and then there will be a deal on the nuclear, or you might call it the denuclearization of Iran. Now what we're doing is we're talking to them in the form of a negotiation. It begins tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see if it's true. I'd love to do that. Save a lot of lives, save a lot of unnecessary power.
Ed Luce, Trump went on to say that had the attack gone ahead, it would have been the biggest since World War II. Let's do a little fact checking here. I think we can agree that Iran's neighbors in the region don't want a return to full-out war. That part probably right. And we know that the MBS did make that call with Trump over the weekend. But the rest of it, how can we believe anything he's saying? We've been down this road so many times before where he threatens a big attack and then walks away from it. You know, Iran calls his bluff. Trump claims negotiations are coming. And then Tehran the next day is like, no, we're not even talking to them. Now there's some mediators, in the region who are trying to get some negotiations going again. Of course, inherently that would be a good thing. But it seems to me this is yet another example of Trump having lost his leverage and he's really stuck with no clear way out.
He is. I mean, it's really interesting that it was a call from Mohammed bin Salman, as you mentioned, Jonathan, on Saturday that persuaded Trump to back off, because Iran has made it very clear that it is prepared to strike the energy infrastructure and other targets in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in countries that really don't want to see this escalation. And Iran has been broadening the zone of its activities, to as far away as Egypt. There was an attempted drone attack on a US ship in Egypt. So Iran is not backing down at all. They're quite happy with escalation because they believe that ultimately this will deter Trump from pursuing this war. They're not backing down, which makes it all the more odd that Trump thinks that these kinds of threats, that this will be the biggest bombing campaign since World War II, are going to deter Iran. It's not deterrable at this point because its reading of this war is that the higher the cost it imposes on Trump and America's allies in the Gulf and beyond the Gulf and on the world economy, the less likely this war is to be resumed in full by Trump. So this bluster is not working. But he keeps trying to throw spaghetti against the wall. One other point is that, Israel was all locked and loaded and ready to join Trump in this new attack on Iran, and wasn't informed that he'd decided to call it off. There's been a real switch since the beginning of this war. Saudi Arabia is now more influential than Israel, and that's a huge deal.
Absolutely a significant development there in the Middle East. For more, let's now bring in staff writer at The Atlantic covering national security and the Defense Department, our friend Nancy Youssef. Nancy, great to see you. First, let's just start this with what's the latest we know about the situation there in the Middle East? And, is there the possibility of talks in the days ahead? And is there any hope they could yield anything?
I think there's always the possibility of talks. We've heard that Qatar is mediating talks between Iran, Oman, and the United States over the future of the Strait of Hormuz. I think the challenge is what those talks yield. For all the threats and counter threats and climb down from threats, the Iranians are not signaling that they feel that they're in a weaker position. And in fact, they're saying they intend to keep supervising the Strait of Hormuz. And meanwhile, you have the president saying that the Strait must be fully open, freely and fully open. And so even on the basic terms of what these talks are supposed to achieve, there seems to be a very fundamental disagreement. And so that's only on one of the four issues that needs to be negotiated: the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions, the future of Iranian proxies, and of course Iran's nuclear program. And so the supposition up until this point has been that the U.S., Iran, Oman must agree on the future of the Strait of Hormuz before they can tackle those more complex topics. And even now, after a flurry of activity of these threats and counter threats, it doesn't seem that those very fundamental questions about what needs to come out of the Strait of Hormuz part of the talks has been settled.
So, Nancy, you and I have a new piece in The Atlantic we co-wrote titled "This May Be Trump's Biggest Error in the War." And I'll read a little bit of it now. The Trump administration's greatest mistake in the Iran war may be its persistent failure to understand Tehran's priorities and motivations, and how much punishment the regime is willing to absorb to prevail. The convoluted and complicated war has swung almost weekly between peace overtures and fighting. Part of the confusion may stem from the fact that Trump himself appears to be of at least two minds about how he wants to proceed. He's vacillated between backing more military action and giving peace talks a chance. The U.S. cannot begin to understand its enemy if it has yet to settle on its own aims or how to achieve them. For now, there are no good options for Trump, and there is no clarity as to how two sides in a widening war can find off-ramps, particularly if they continue to misinterpret each other's actions. Both sides seem to agree on one thing: there is no end in sight to the war. And Nancy, I mean, let's just say it, pretty smart stuff there. But let's talk about what could come next. Like we've talked a lot about Trump has no good options. That's true. Okay, so he has bad options. Walk us through a couple of the bad options. Like what are the ways that he could settle to try to get out of this?
So he could announce that the war is over and that he's won. The Ayatollah is dead. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. If they try to get a nuclear weapon, the United States will go back to war. I'm not sure that the stock markets and others would believe it, but he could declare that and announce that he's leaving. He could also escalate strikes on Iran, and he signaled that he thinks that this is an effective way to do it. And during the Camp David talks, he said that he thinks that they'll reach a point where Iran can't take it anymore. The idea being that you do just enough strikes to sort of tip the balance out of the regime control and lead to its collapse. But of course, the question becomes what happens if that doesn't work, and how does Iran retaliate? And by the way, those retaliations will demand the United States go through its dwindling supply of munitions and interceptors. And so there's a risk associated with that. Or he could go back to the negotiation table, as he's signaled that he's been willing to do. But because the Iranians are not backing down, they are not acting like a nation that has come under attack, but one that thinks that it has the upper hand. To go back to those negotiations, the United States would have to make some concessions that has so far been unwilling to make on things like the Strait of Hormuz. It might be that there's a negotiation that's reached that the Iranians have more control of the strait than the president had wanted at the start of this war. And so that's why there aren't great options, because there are munition shortages that limit the U.S. capability militarily. The threats of strikes has cost the United States credibility at the negotiation table. And the president has in the past declared that he's won before, only to then go back to war. And we should note that this is all against the backdrop of midterm elections coming up in less than 100 days and growing unpopularity with this war. Can the president afford to restart fighting that could lead to a rise of oil and gas prices so close to a midterm election when that issue has become a key one for voters as we approach this election season?
Yeah, the midterms are approaching and gas prices rising, really noticeable this weekend. This is every time this could get worse for Trump. To this point, it has. And David French, your latest opinion piece for the New York Times is titled "The War That Could Swallow the World." And in it, you write in part this: the only thing worse than President Trump starting an unconstitutional war is Trump losing control of that war. I've often wondered what it was like to be alive in the summer of 1914, much less 1938 and 1939. When did people start to realize that the world was on the brink of catastrophe? Speak up too soon or too frequently, and you look ridiculous, like the Chicken Little of World War. Speak up too late, and you live, if you live, with bitter regret. I do not think that world war is inevitable, nor do I think it's probable. But it is now more possible than it has been at any other time since the end of the Cold War. And the American government is led by the worst rulers in the modern history of the United States. Our future may depend in part on American voters deciding to give Congress a spinal transplant. But that requires us to do something that democracies have rarely, if ever, done successfully. See the catastrophe coming and act decisively before a terrible war swallows the world. David French, obviously an ominous warning there. We have seen signs in the recent week or two that this war could expand. Other countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, more getting involved. tell us more as to why you think that might just be the beginning, and that could expand much further and in a much more disastrous fashion.
Well, consider this. When I said at the very beginning, Trump has lost control of this war, I don't think that when he walked into it, he expected it would be spreading across the region the way that it has. He's said as much. I don't think that this is what he wants, to have the Houthis have entered the conflict, to begin to try to control the Red Sea. Already in the region, it's expanded beyond Trump's control and beyond Trump's reach. And then you have these other really ominous developments. You've had a Ukrainian strike on an Iranian boat that Ukraine claims was transporting weapons and other related war material between Iran and Russia. You've had information and evidence that Russia is helping Iran target U.S. bases, making Iranian strikes more comprehensive. At the same time, Russia continues to be undeterred, even though it's taking massive battlefield losses. You recently had a Russian missile landing in a Polish field, which there have been drones that have crossed into Poland. First missile from Russia that we know of that's crossed into Polish airspace, impacting in Poland. Just again and again and again, you're seeing China supply missiles to Iran reportedly. This war is not in his control. And right now, every combatant in every one of the major world conflicts is escalating. And so this is a situation I wanted people to begin to try to move their eyes just from focusing in on the in and outs of each ceasefire or false ceasefire or each deal or each fake deal, and instead take a bigger, broader view. These two conflicts, to some degree, are merging and they're expanding. And this is extraordinarily dangerous. In which of our world leaders is serious about trying to reach a resolution? I don't see anyone quite yet.